In the summer of 1846, a French-born scholar named Constantin Rafinesque confronted one of the enormous earthworks of the American Midwest. A mound so vast in footprint that it dwarfed anything most of his contemporaries had ever measured, rising story after story above the Mississippi floodplain, near what is now Collinsville, Illinois. He looked at it, and he refused to believe what was directly in front of him. Not because the evidence was unclear, because the truth was, to him, unthinkable. For nearly 300 years, tens of thousands of massive earthworks lay scattered across the American landscape. Geometric enclosures larger than Roman amphitheaters, effigies shaped like serpents, a quarter-mile long, cities that once housed more people than medieval London. And, for most of those 3 centuries, the people who built them were written out of the story on purpose. Not because no one knew who they were, because too many people already suspected and could not accept it. But the strangest part of this story was never that these cities had disappeared. It was that American writers and scholars spent generations inventing someone else to take credit for them. This is the story of how American writers, scholars, and institutions looked directly at the achievements of Native American civilizations and spent generations choosing almost anything else instead. It's a story about a scientific fraud so widespread it shaped school textbooks, government policy, and the fate of entire nations, and about the handful of researchers who finally tore it down. By the end, you'll understand why an earthwork bigger than the base of the Great Pyramid still sits nearly unknown in Illinois, why the word Moundbuilder became one of the most consequential lies in American history, and how the men who exposed that lie changed what civilization was even allowed to mean. Stand at the base of Monk's Mound today, in what's now Cahokia Mound State Historic Site, and the scale is genuinely disorienting. Around the year 1100, this was the center of a city of thousands. By some estimates, tens of thousands, one of the largest urban centers in North America at its peak. Its central plaza was engineered on a precise grid, aligned to solstices. Its builders moved an almost unimaginable volume of earth, using nothing but woven baskets, one load at a time, across generations. There was no beast of burden in North America capable of hauling that load. No wheel in regular use for transport, just human labor, coordinated at a scale that required political organization, food surplus, and long-distance trade networks stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. And Cahokia wasn't alone, but there was a problem. The more sites archaeologists found, the harder the old story became to defend. In Louisiana, at a site called Poverty Point, people who lived without agriculture, hunter-gatherers, by the old definition, built 6 concentric earthen ridges, forming a half-mile arc, thousands of years before the pyramids of Giza rose. In Ohio, the Serpent Mound coils across a ridge for over 1,300 feet, its head aligned to the summer solstice sunset. None of this fit the story America told itself in the 18th and 19th centuries, that the continent, before European arrival, held no real civilization at all. Just wilderness and scattered, simple peoples incapable of building anything permanent. So when settlers and early scholars encountered the mounds, a strange kind of denial took hold. Thomas Jefferson, to his credit, actually excavated a mound on his own Virginia property in 1784 and documented it with real scientific care, one of the earliest stratigraphic excavations in American history. But Jefferson was the exception. Within a generation, a very different theory had taken over, and it spread with the force of accepted fact. The mounds, newspapers, and popular books insisted, could not possibly have been built by the ancestors of the native peoples still living nearby. They must have been built by someone else, a vanished race, Phoenicians perhaps, Israelites, Welsh explorers, survivors of Atlantis, anyone at all, except the indigenous nations whose descendants were, at that very moment, being pushed off that same land. And here's where the story turns dark. This wasn't idle speculation. It intersected directly with the politics of Indian removal. Through the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, the exact years of the Trail of Tears, of treaty after treaty stripping native nations of ancestral territory, the Moundbuilder myth gave white America a convenient moral shortcut. If Native Americans hadn't built these monuments, then they weren't the true heirs of this land's greatness. If a lost, superior race had built them and then vanished or been wiped out by savage Indians, then Removing living native nations wasn't erasing a civilization. It was merely finishing something that, in this invented narrative, had already happened once before. The myth didn't just insult the builders, it helped rationalize taking their land a second time. The theory reached absurd heights. Popular books described lost armies, ancient battles between mound builders and the ancestors of native peoples, entire fictional wars with no archaeological basis whatsoever. Politicians cited the myth in speeches. It was taught uncritically in American schools for decades. And here's a detail that tends to catch people off guard. Some of the era's most respected scientific circles repeated it too, not as fringe belief, but as considered opinion, published in serious volumes. Then, in 1881, someone finally decided to test the myth properly, and what he found would destroy it. Congress funded the Bureau of Ethnology under the Smithsonian Institution and put a self-taught entomologist named Cyrus Thomas in charge of settling the mound builder question once and for all. Thomas, notably, started out believing the myth himself. He assumed his job was simply to confirm it. Instead, he did something almost nobody before him had done systematically. He sent field teams to excavate, catalog, and compare mounds across the continent using rigorous method rather than assumption. His crews documented over 2,000 sites. The evidence, when it was finally gathered honestly, told an unambiguous story. And it was not the one Thomas expected to write. Artifacts recovered from mound burials matched, layer by layer, the tools, pottery, and ornamentation of native nations still living in those same regions. Construction techniques showed clear continuity, not rupture. There was no lost race. There was no vanished civilization wiped out by newcomers. The mounds had been built, used, and maintained by the direct ancestors of the very peoples the myth had been used to displace. In 1894, Thomas published his findings in a report exceeding 700 pages, and with it, the Moundbuilder myth was, scientifically, at least, dead. But scientific death and cultural death are not the same thing. Even after Thomas's report, the myth lingered in popular imagination for decades. Textbooks were slow to correct, and the deeper damage, the removals, the broken treaties, the generations of dispossession the myth had helped rationalize, was already done, and no excavation report could undo it. That's the uncomfortable core of this story. Exposing a lie doesn't automatically repair what the lie was used to justify. What remains today is a landscape of extraordinary monuments still fighting for the recognition they were denied for 2 centuries. Cahokia wasn't designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site until 1982. Many mound sites were plowed under for farmland or paved over for highways and parking lots before anyone thought to ask who had built them or why they mattered. It's a strange, quietly devastating irony. America spent 100 years inventing a false ancient civilization to explain the mounds, while bulldozing the real one to make room for shopping centers. The mystery, in the end, it was never really who built the mounds. The evidence had been sitting in the ground the entire time, waiting. The real mystery, the one this story actually asks you to sit with, is why so many people, for so long, needed the builders to be someone else. So the next time you hear ancient civilization and picture Egypt or Mesopotamia or the Maya, it's worth remembering this instead. One of the largest urban centers in North America stood on the banks of the Mississippi in the year 1100 in what is now Illinois. And for most of American history, the society that grew up around its ruins often worked harder to deny it than to understand it. The dirt is still there. The people whose ancestors raised it, basket by basket, are still there too. What took so long wasn't the evidence, it was the willingness to look at it honestly.